He had a clear shot. A crippled American bomber over Germany, guns silent, engines failing. One burst, and it was over. But on December 20th, 1943, a German fighter ace chose not to fire. Decades later, the two enemy pilots found each other and became friends. This is the true story of honor in the middle of total war. Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown was 21 years old. He flew a B-17F Flying Fortress called WWII Pub, part of the 379th Bomb Group, 8th Air Force, operating out of Kimballton, England. It was only his first combat tour. He had not yet grown hardened. The losses around him were still fresh, still personal. The mission that morning was clear and direct. Bomb the Focke-Wulf aircraft factories in Bremen, destroy German production capacity, reduce the Luftwaffe's strength. The Americans crossed the North Sea in tight formation, hundreds of bombers arranged in defensive combat boxes. Each aircraft relied on the others. Mutual firepower was survival. German radar had already detected them. By the time the formation approached Bremen, Luftwaffe fighters were climbing to intercept. Flak batteries were locked onto altitude. At approximately 11 a.m., the sky turned black. Heavy anti-aircraft bursts exploded inside the formation. The shock waves struck the bombers like physical blows. Metal fragments ripped through aluminum skin. One shell detonated directly near Charlie Brown's aircraft. The nose was torn open. Plexiglass shattered. The bombardier was wounded. The aircraft lurched violently. Instruments flickered and died. Moments later, another burst damaged the right wing. Two engines lost power almost instantly. Oil streamed backward along the fuselage. Inside the bomber, chaos. The tail section had been shredded. The tail gunner was badly injured. Waist gunners were hit. Blood mixed with hydraulic fluid on the floor. Brown fought the controls. The B-17 pulled hard to the right. He compensated with rudder, trimming desperately to keep altitude. The bombs were released over Bremen. The mission objective, technically, had been achieved. But survival was no longer part of the plan. As the formation turned west toward England, WWII Pub could not maintain position. With damaged engines and structural failure, she began to fall behind. And in bomber operations over Germany, falling behind meant isolation. Isolation meant death. On the ground near Bremen, another pilot received the scramble order. Franz Stiegler, age 28, a veteran of North Africa, holder of numerous confirmed victories, ran toward his Messerschmitt Bf 109. Stiegler had seen combat long before Brown ever touched a B-17 cockpit. He understood bomber vulnerabilities. He knew exactly where to aim. The report from ground control was simple. A damaged American bomber trailing the formation, an easy interception. Stiegler climbed quickly and spotted the aircraft. It was obvious which one. The B-17 was alone. Its formation was gone. Its right wing hung damaged. It struggled to hold altitude at roughly 10,000 feet. Far below normal bombing height, he positioned behind and slightly below the bomber, closing in for the kill. At this distance, Brown's crew should have opened fire. They did not. Stiegler moved closer. He expected defensive guns, tracer fire, resistance. Instead, he saw something else. The tail was nearly destroyed. The rear gun position was silent. Large holes tore through the fuselage. Through those holes, he could see crew members inside, wounded and exposed. The bomber was not fighting. It was barely flying. Stiegler eased off the trigger. He could end it in seconds. A short burst into the cockpit, a strike into the fuel tanks. Standard procedure. but he remembered something his former commander had told him in Africa. If you ever see a helpless enemy, you do not shoot. It was not written in doctrine. It was not policy. It was personal code. Inside the B-17, Charlie Brown saw the German fighter sliding into position on his left side. He prepared for impact. He was certain they were about to die. Instead, the Messerschmitt held formation, close enough to see the pilot's face, close enough to see that he was not firing. Stiegler moved closer still. He tried to signal. He gestured downward. Land. Surrender. Put the aircraft down in Germany. Save your crew. Brown shook his head. He would not land in enemy territory. Not with wounded men aboard. Even damaged. He would try to reach England. For several long seconds, the two aircraft flew side by side over Germany. A German ace and a crippled American bomber crewed by boys barely old enough to shave. No gunfire, no words. Only the steady vibration of engines and the wind against torn aluminum. Stiegler realized something else. German anti-aircraft batteries along the coast would see the B-17 and fire automatically. They would not know its condition. If they opened up, the bomber would not survive. He made a decision. He moved to the far side of the bomber and began flying escort position. From the ground, the two aircraft might appear as a formation. For several minutes, the German fighter protected the American bomber from his own country's guns. Brown did not understand what was happening. He expected reinforcements at any moment. He believed this was some tactic before a final attack. But none came. As they approached the German coastline and the North Sea beyond, Stiegler knew he could go no farther. If he crossed too far west, British fighters might intercept him. German radar would also track him. He slid closer one final time. He looked at the American pilot, and he saluted. Then he broke away. The Bf-109 banked sharply and returned toward Germany. The B-17 continued alone toward the sea. Against all probability, Charlie Brown and his crew reached England. They crash-landed at RAF Seething. The aircraft was later described as barely controllable. Entire sections of the tail were missing. Control cables were nearly severed. Intelligence officers debriefed Brown immediately. He told them about the German pilot. He was ordered not to speak of it again. The reasoning was practical. Bomber crews could not afford hesitation. War required certainty. Franz Stiegler, for his part, said nothing to his superiors. Failing to shoot down an enemy aircraft thought it could have meant court-martial, even execution. He kept silent. Two men, opposite sides of a war consuming millions, both carrying the memory of a moment that should not have happened. They did not know each other's names, not yet, and for decades they would not. Winter turned into spring, but for Charlie Brown, the sky over Europe did not become any safer. After December 20th, 1943, the incident over Bremen was quietly buried in paperwork and silence. The damaged Ye Olde pub was written off. Replacement aircraft arrived. Crews were reshuffled, schedules resumed. The 8th Air Force did not slow down. January 1944 brought more missions deep into Germany. Industrial centers, rail yards, oil refineries. Each briefing room felt the same. Maps pinned to boards, red yarn tracing the route, flak concentrations circled in grease pencil. Losses were read without emotion. Brown flew again and again. At altitude, the cold reached 40 degrees below zero. Oxygen masks froze against skin. Frost formed inside the cockpit windows. Engines droned at constant strain. Every time they crossed the German coast, the same calculation returned. Flak first, fighters second. The Luftwaffe adapted. Head-on attacks became more common. German pilots realized the B-17's nose was more vulnerable than its tail. Brown saw bombers explode mid-air. He saw parachutes open, and sometimes not open. The memory of the German fighter who had spared him did not make him soft. If attacked, he would defend himself. His gunners would fire. War was still war, but something had shifted internally. The enemy was no longer a faceless silhouette in the sun. It had a human outline. Franz Stiegler's war also intensified. By early 1944, Germany was under constant bombardment. American daylight raids were followed by British night attacks. Cities burned, factories collapsed, fuel reserves dwindled. The Luftwaffe scrambled whatever aircraft it could. Experienced pilots like Stiegler were now defending home skies. He flew against larger formations than he had ever seen in North Africa. American bombers stretched across the horizon, escorted deeper and deeper by long-range P-51 Mustangs. The advantage was slowly shifting. Each interception became more dangerous. Each takeoff carried heavier odds. Still, he flew. He did not know whether the American bomber he had spared had survived the winter. He assumed it had either crashed into the sea or been lost on another mission. In war, survival was temporary. In February 1944, during one of the large-scale raids against central Germany, Brown's new B-17 formation encountered heavy fighter resistance near the target area. Among the defending German units were veteran pilots, some recently transferred from other fronts. For several minutes, the sky dissolved into separate, violent engagements. Fighters slashed through bomber formations. Gunners fired in all directions. Contrails twisted overhead. In the chaos, Brown briefly saw a Bf-109 streak past his aircraft at close range. No escorting gesture, no hesitation, just speed and distance. Inside the German cockpit, Stiegler also saw a B-17 pass within visual range, damaged but still flying steady. For a fraction of a second, both men registered familiarity. But at 20,000 feet in combat, there is no time for recognition. The two aircraft crossed paths and continued in opposite directions. Neither fired, neither signaled. They disappeared into separate sectors of the same sky. Whether it was truly the same two men or only coincidence, neither could ever confirm. But years later, both would admit to wondering. By mid-1944, the Allied advance in Europe accelerated. D-Day opened a second front. American bombers intensified attacks on oil production and transportation networks. German fuel shortages became critical. Stiegler flew fewer missions as aircraft and supplies diminished. Brown completed his required missions and rotated home before the end of the war in Europe. But the conflict did not end in a clean moment for either of them. It eroded gradually. Germany's defenses weakened. Allied air superiority became overwhelming. The Luftwaffe fought on, but the sky was no longer theirs. When the war finally ended in May 1945, both men were alive. That fact alone placed them among a shrinking minority of combat aviators. Brown returned to civilian life in the United States. He built a career, raised a family, and tried to leave the war where it belonged. In the past, Stiegler faced a shattered Germany, airfields abandoned, aircraft destroyed, cities in ruins. Eventually, he emigrated to Canada, starting over in a new country far from the sky where he had once fought. Neither spoke publicly about December 20th, 1943. Not because they forgot, but because some experiences are easier to carry in silence. If stories like this matter to you, The quiet moments between enemies, the human decisions inside massive wars. Take a second to support the channel. A quick like pushes this story further, and a subscription keeps these forgotten encounters from disappearing into history's background noise. Now, back to the sky. For decades, Charlie Brown wondered about the German pilot. He remembered the damaged tail section, the motion to land, the final salute over the North Sea. By the late 1980s, he began searching. Veteran associations, Air Force newsletters, old records. He described the date clearly, December 20th, 1943. He described Bremen. He described the escort. Years passed without answer, until finally a letter arrived. It was from a former Luftwaffe pilot who believed he had been the one. The details aligned, the damage, the wounded crew visible through the fuselage, the refusal to surrender, the escort to the coastline, the salute, the name at the bottom of the letter, Franz Stiegler. Nearly half a century after crossing paths in the sky, the two men had found each other again, not through radar or gun sights, but through memory, and the meeting that followed would be unlike anything either of them had experienced during the war. Charlie Brown did not open the letter immediately. He recognized the weight of it before he unfolded the paper. The return address alone, Europe, a former Luftwaffe pilot, was enough to send him back more than 40 years. Before he read a single word, he found himself remembering the final months of the war. By early 1945, Brown was no longer flying combat missions over Germany. He had completed his required tour in 1944 and rotated back to the United States. But the war never really left him. He followed it through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and letters from men still overseas. He remembered one morning in May 1945 clearly. He had been working a civilian job by then, adjusting slowly to a world without oxygen masks and engine vibration. A co-worker burst through the door holding a newspaper. "Germany has surrendered." The words did not feel real at first. He stepped outside into the sunlight and listened as car horns began sounding across town. People gathered in small groups. Some cheered, some cried. Strangers shook hands. Victory in Europe Day. For Charlie, the reaction was quieter. He thought about the bomber crews who had not made it home. He thought about Bremen. He thought about the damaged tail of Ye Olde pub swaying in the wind over the North Sea. He wondered if the German pilot had survived the collapse of the Reich. The final days of the war in Europe had been chaotic. From what he read and heard later, German airfields were short on fuel. Pilots were ordered into desperate defensive sorties. Allied bombers operated with near-constant escort. The sky that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe was no longer theirs. Brown imagined what it must have looked like from the other side. A crumbling defense, cities burning, retreating forces. When Germany officially surrendered on May 7th, 1945, the war that had defined his early adulthood was over. He had been 21 over Bremen. Now he was 23. 2 years that felt like 20. Returning home had not been immediate. After completing his combat tour, he had remained on duty for a period of reassignment and processing. Paperwork, medical checks, administrative clearance. Then came transport across the Atlantic. Slower than combat flights, quieter, filled with young men who were already trying to imagine civilian futures. The voyage back took days, then rail travel across the United States. He remembered stepping off the train into familiar air. No flak bursts, no formation assembly, just the sound of ordinary life continuing. It took time to adjust. For months he would wake early, expecting a briefing. He would hear distant mechanical noise and instinctively think of engines. Within a few years, life stabilized. He married. The ceremony was small. Family, close friends, no military formality. He rarely spoke about the air war, not because he was hiding anything, but because it belonged to a different world. By the early 1950s, nearly a decade had passed since Bremen. He built a career. He raised children. He watched the world shift into the Cold War. Jet aircraft replaced the propeller-driven fighters he had known. New conflicts emerged in Korea. Later, Vietnam. Sometimes he would pause when he saw footage of bombers on television. He would think about December 20th, 1943. He would think about the German pilot who had flown close enough to see his face. But the name remained unknown. Years turned into decades. 40 years after the war, Brown was no longer the young lieutenant gripping a damaged control column. He was a grandfather. Time softened many memories, but not that one. Eventually, he began asking questions. Veterans groups, Air Force associations, European contacts. He described the mission date precisely. December 20th, 1943, Bremen. He described the crippled B-17, the escort, the salute. For a long time, there was silence. Then the letter arrived. Now sitting at his table with decades behind him. Marriage, children, a life rebuilt. He finally unfolded it. He was no longer the 21-year-old pilot over Germany. He was a man who had lived more than 40 years beyond the day he expected to die. And he was about to learn the name of the man who had made that possible. Charlie Brown unfolded the letter slowly. The paper was ordinary, the handwriting precise, almost formal, but the content erased 46 years in seconds. The writer introduced himself clearly. Franz Stiegler, former Luftwaffe pilot. He described the mission date, December 20th, 1943. The American raid on Bremen, the damaged B-17 trailing behind the formation. He wrote about seeing the torn tail section, the exposed crew through the fuselage, the silence of the defensive guns. He wrote about pulling alongside the bomber and realizing it was finished. Or should have been. He mentioned signaling for Brown to land in Germany. He mentioned the refusal. And finally, he described flying escort to the German coastline and saluting before turning back. Brown stopped reading for a moment. The memory was no longer one-sided. The German pilot remembered it exactly as he did. He finished the letter. At the end, Stiegler wrote something simple. I often wondered if you survived. Brown sat back in his chair. For decades, he had assumed the German pilot had probably been killed later in the war. The casualty rates among fighter pilots were brutal, especially in the final years when Allied air superiority tightened. But here was proof. He had survived. Brown wrote back. He confirmed the details from his perspective. The flak damage, the wounded crew, the crash landing in England. He described the intelligence officer's warning not to speak about the incident. He admitted something he had never said publicly. When he first saw the Bf 109 on his wing, he had believed his crew had seconds to live. He had gripped the controls, waiting for gunfire. Instead, he had received a salute. The correspondence grew. Letters turned into phone calls. For the first time, they heard each other's voices. The accents were different, the languages shaped by different continents, but the shared memory created immediate clarity. They discussed technical details first: aircraft types, altitudes, damage assessment. Pilots speak in specifics. Stiegler explained that he had approached from the bomber's blind spot. He had been within effective cannon range. He had chosen not to fire. He also admitted the risk. In 1943, failing to destroy an enemy aircraft could have resulted in severe punishment. Germany was under intense pressure. Allied bombing was crippling production. Brown understood the gravity of that decision. This was not a sentimental gesture made in peacetime. It had been a wartime choice made under military expectation. Eventually, they agreed to meet in person. The first meeting took place in the United States. When Franz Stiegler stepped off the plane, he was no longer the confident 28-year-old fighter ace defending the Reich. He was an elderly man, walking carefully, carrying a lifetime of experience. Charlie Brown met him at the airport. There were no uniforms, no rank, no aircraft, just two former pilots facing each other. For a moment, neither spoke. Then they embraced. Observers later described it as immediate and genuine, not theatrical, not forced. Brown introduced Stiegler to his family as the man who saved my life. Stiegler shook his head slightly and replied that he had simply done what he believed was right. But both understood the magnitude. Had Stiegler fired that day, there would have been no crash landing in England, no marriage, no children, no decades of life that followed. They spent hours talking. They reconstructed the flight path over Bremen. They discussed the flak patterns. They talked about engine failures, formation spacing, defensive tactics. They also talked about the final months of the war. Stiegler described flying in 1944 and 1945 as Germany's situation deteriorated. Fuel shortages, inexperienced pilots, increasingly overwhelming Allied formations. He admitted that by late 1944, survival often depended more on luck than skill. Brown described returning home, hearing of Germany's surrender in May 1945 from co-workers who rushed into the street with newspapers. He told Stiegler about the train ride home, the quiet adjustment to civilian life, the wedding years later. They realized something unsettling and humbling at the same time. Both had survived when many around them had not. Over the following years, they appeared together at veteran gatherings. They did not frame their story as reconciliation between nations. They presented it as a decision made by individuals in a specific moment. They emphasized that war is built on systems, strategies, production capacity, attrition, but fought by human beings who sometimes face choices not covered by doctrine. For audiences, the story carried weight. For the two men, it carried clarity. December 20th, 1943, had not changed the course of the war. Bremen was bombed. The air campaign continued. Germany surrendered. History followed its trajectory. But on that day, one bomber crew lived. And decades later, two former enemies shook hands, not because policy required it, but because memory demanded acknowledgement. By the early 2000s, both men were advanced in age. Their meetings became less frequent, but no less meaningful. They often ended conversations the same way, recalling the cold air over Bremen and the strange stillness of two aircraft flying side by side without firing. What began as an engagement in war had become a friendship in peace, and neither of them had expected that outcome when they crossed paths at 10,000 feet in December 1943. As the years passed, the story of December 20th, 1943, began to move beyond the two men who had lived it. It was no longer just correspondence between Charlie Brown and Franz Stiegler. Their families knew it. Veteran communities knew it. Eventually, historians and authors took interest, but neither man treated it as legend. When they spoke publicly, they focused on context. They explained what the air war over Europe actually looked like in late 1943. The 8th Air Force was still fighting for dominance. Long-range fighter escort had not yet fully matured. Bomber losses were heavy. Crews calculated survival in missions completed, not in months served. Brown described the structural damage to Ye Olde pub in technical detail. How the vertical stabilizer had been nearly severed, how control response had become sluggish, how engine failure created asymmetric drag that required constant correction. He emphasized that the aircraft's survival was not dramatic luck alone. It was a combination of crew coordination, aerodynamic tolerance built into the B-17 design, and the decision not to abandon the wounded. Stiegler, in contrast, described the tactical picture from the German side. By December 1943, Allied bombing was increasingly destructive. Aircraft production, oil facilities, and transportation networks were under sustained pressure. German fighter pilots were expected to intercept aggressively. He explained that he had approached the B-17 from behind and below, standard attack vector to avoid concentrated defensive fire. He confirmed what Brown had always suspected. He had been well within firing range. A short burst from his 20mm cannon would have destroyed the cockpit. He had not fired. When asked why, Stiegler did not offer moral speeches. He spoke of professional code. He had been taught that a pilot fights armed opponents. A bomber that could not defend itself, with wounded crew visible and guns silent, did not meet that standard in his mind. It was not an official Luftwaffe doctrine. It was personal judgment. That distinction mattered, because in 1943, Germany, deviation from expectation could have severe consequences. Stiegler acknowledged that had another German pilot witnessed the escort, he might have faced court-martial. The decision carried risk. As they traveled to events together, audiences often expected emotion. What they received instead was restraint. Brown would calmly recount the moment he expected the first burst of cannon fire. Stiegler would calmly describe seeing the bomber crew through the torn fuselage. Neither embellished, neither dramatized. The power of the story came from its simplicity. 2 aircraft, close range, a choice. Privately, their friendship deepened. They exchanged holiday cards. They visited each other's homes. Brown's children grew comfortable around the former German fighter ace. Stiegler's family welcomed the American bomber pilot without reservation. History had placed them on opposite sides. Time had removed that barrier. They sometimes joked about the improbability of it all. Stiegler once remarked that in 1943, if someone had told him he would one day drink coffee with an American bomber pilot in peace, he would not have believed it. Brown agreed. As both men entered their eschatties, the tone of their conversations shifted slightly. They spoke more often about those who had not survived. Brown remembered members of his squadron who never completed their tours. Stiegler remembered fellow Luftwaffe pilots who failed to return from interception missions. They both recognized that survival had been partly skill, partly decision, and partly chance. December 20th, 1943, had been one of those narrow margins. By the mid-2000s, their health began to decline. Travel became limited. Public appearances slowed. But their connection remained intact. They would still reference that cold sky over Bremen, not as a battlefield, but as a shared point of origin. In interviews near the end of their lives, both were asked whether they regretted anything about that day. Brown said no. Stiegler said no. Neither expressed bitterness. Neither minimized the war. They understood its scale. Millions dead. Continents scarred. Their story did not erase that. It existed within it. In March 2008, Franz Stiegler passed away. News reached Brown quickly. He was deeply affected. For more than a decade, Stiegler had not been the German pilot. He had been Franz, a friend, A reminder that history is built not only from strategies and offensives, but from individual decisions. Later that same year, in November 2008, Charlie Brown died. Within months, both men were gone. Their families remained in contact. The story continued to circulate, not as myth, not as propaganda, but as documented fact, supported by maintenance reports, mission logs, and personal testimony. December 20th, 1943, had once been just another bombing mission against Bremen. It had become something else. A moment where doctrine paused, where two pilots saw each other clearly, and where a war built on destruction allowed, briefly, an act of restraint. December 20th, 1943. A damaged B-17 over Bremen, a German fighter pilot in perfect firing position, and a decision that broke the expected pattern of war. That is where the story truly lives. Not in grand strategy, not in production numbers, not in victory parades, but in one moment. Charlie Brown survived that day and went on to live a full life. Marriage, children, decades that should not have existed, according to the mathematics of air combat. Franz Stiegler survived as well, carrying the memory of a choice made in seconds. They found each other nearly half a century later. They shook hands. They became friends. Two men who once met through gun sights ended their lives connected not by war, but by respect. That is enough. If this story stayed with you, make sure it reaches others. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling real World War II stories, the ones built on documented events and human decisions. Leave a like. It helps this story travel further. And I'd really like to read your comments. Did someone in your family serve in World War II? Or in another conflict? Air Force, Army, Navy, Marines, even just a name and where they served. Share it below. Let's build a small archive together in the comments. History isn't only written in books. Sometimes it lives in families. I'll see you in the next story.